to know.
Everybody ought to know.
Everybody ought to know. Everybody ought to know. Everybody ought to know who Jesus is, who my blessed Savior is.
Everybody ought to tell.
Everybody ought to tell.
Everybody ought to tell.
Everybody ought to tell. Everybody ought to tell. Everybody ought to tell who Jesus is.
He's the lily of the valley.
Jesus is the lily of the valley.
He's the bright and morning star.
He's the shining star sent down from heaven.
He's the fairest of thousands.
He's the fairest of the many thousand. Everybody ought to know.
Everybody ought to bring.
Everybody ought to bring.
Everybody ought to bring.
Everybody ought to bring. Everybody ought to bring. Everybody ought to bring a soul to Him. Bring a dying soul to Him.
Everybody ought to sing.
Everybody ought to sing.
Everybody ought to sing.
Everybody ought to sing. Everybody ought to sing. Everybody ought to sing that praise to Him.
He's the lily of the
Jesus is the lily of the valley.
He's the bright and morning
He's the shining star sent down from heaven.
He's the fairest of them.
He's the fairest of the many thousand. Everybody ought to know.
He's the lily of the
Jesus is the
valley.
lily of the valley.
He's the bright and morning
He's the shining star
star.
sent down from heaven.
He's the fairest of them.
He's the fairest of the many thousand.